HOA Karen charged 500 strangers $50 each to camp on my land without ever asking me. That's $25,000 she collected in advance, selling access to property my family had owned for 3 generations. She advertised it as a community wellness retreat, complete with camping, yoga, and late-night events, all scheduled directly on my back pasture, as if my name didn't exist on the deed. What she never expected was that the quiet old man she dismissed had spent 30 years working emergency scenes, documenting disasters, and keeping a level head when situations turned dangerous. And she definitely didn't know that the wooden boxes sitting calmly near the tree line weren't decorations. By the end of that weekend, when authorities and medical crews finished sorting through the chaos, Karen finally learned what happens when entitlement collides with written law. My name is Wesley Turner. I'm 62 years old, retired, and I've lived on the same 15 acres outside a small California town since the day I was born. My grandfather bought this land in the early 1950s, back when the area was nothing but orchards, dirt roads, and neighbors who greeted each other by name. He built the original farmhouse with his own hands, raised 3 children here, and passed it down to my father, who spent most of his life as a firefighter. When I grew up, I followed him into the service, spent 3 decades responding to accidents, house fires, wildfires, and emergencies that most people only see on the news. When my knees finally gave out and my wife Sharon started getting sick, I came home for good. Sharon passed away 3 years ago after a long illness. The house felt too big after that. The land felt quiet in a way that was heavy rather than peaceful. Friends checked in at first. Then life moved on and the days stretched longer. I lived on my pension, kept things simple, and tried to avoid unnecessary stress. Selling the land was never an option. Developing it wasn't either. This place carried too much history, too many memories, and too much of her. Instead, I needed something steady to focus on. Something alive. Something that required patience rather than strength. That's how I became a beekeeper. I started small. 2 hives, placed properly according to county rules, registered, inspected, and maintained exactly by the book. I took classes, talked to agricultural officers, and followed every regulation because I'd spent my life seeing what happens when people cut corners. The bees gave me structure. Mornings started with coffee sweetened by my own honey. Afternoons ended with quiet walks along the fence line, listening to the calm hum that meant everything was working the way it should. Neighbors appreciated the pollination. Gardens improved. Complaints never came from anyone who actually lived nearby. Things changed when Karen Westfield arrived. Karen moved into the large new development that had sprung up along the edge of the old farmland. She and her husband bought the biggest house on the block, the kind with oversized windows and landscaping that needed constant maintenance. She introduced herself during her first week by pulling into my driveway uninvited, wearing workout clothes and holding a phone like it was an extension of her hand. She told me she was passionate about community standards and hoped I'd be willing to cooperate moving forward. I smiled politely and assumed that was the end of it. It wasn't. Within months, Karen positioned herself as president of the Homeowners Association. Even though my land was not part of the HOA, never had been, and predated the entire development by decades, she decided that detail wasn't important. Her first complaints were mild. She mentioned my old trucks. She asked about my fencing. She said some residents were nervous about bees. I showed her permits, distance requirements, inspection records, and letters from neighbors confirming they had no problem at all. She barely glanced at them. The letters started shortly after. Official-looking notices printed on HOA letterhead. Warnings about fines she had no authority to issue. References to ordinances that didn't exist. Accusations that grew more aggressive with every envelope. When that didn't provoke a reaction, Karen escalated again. She filed complaints with animal control. She brought small groups of residents to my fence and pointed at my hives as if they were toxic waste. She accused me of lowering property values and creating unsafe conditions. I stayed calm. I documented everything. Fire investigation taught me the value of details. Dates, times, exact wording, screenshots, recorded conversations where legal. Copies of every message and letter. Karen wanted confrontation. She wanted me angry or defensive. When she didn't get that, she looked for other ways to pressure me. She started talking online. In community groups and neighborhood forums, she painted me as uncooperative, unstable, and resistant to progress. She avoided specifics, relying instead on vague language about safety and well-being. A few people I barely knew began asking if I was doing all right, if the rumors were true. That was when I understood this wasn't about bees at all. It was about control, and she didn't like that my land existed outside her authority. By early spring, strangers started appearing. At first, it was just a few people crossing the fence line, rolling yoga mats out on grass that didn't belong to them. They claimed Karen said it was fine. She insisted there was historical access. A single visit to the county recorder proved that was a lie. There were no easements, no shared use agreements, and no exceptions. I posted no trespassing signs clearly and legally. They were ignored. Then the groups got larger. 15 people, 20, matching outfits, music playing quietly at first, then louder. Phones out, photos taken, my land treated like a scenic backdrop. I installed trail cameras. I recorded license plates. I continued documenting because by then I knew something bigger was coming. Karen denied everything publicly, insisting she wasn't responsible for individual behavior while privately continuing to encourage it. 3 weeks later, sitting alone at my kitchen table late at night, I opened Facebook and felt my stomach drop. Karen had created a public event. Professional graphics, sponsors listed, hundreds of attendees already confirmed. The location pin sat directly on top of my property. Camping included, tickets required, payment links active. As I scrolled through the comments, one thought kept repeating in my mind. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was intentional, organized, and profitable trespass. I closed the laptop and sat there longer than I realized, listening to the refrigerator hum and the distant sound of traffic. I'd spent years responding to emergencies caused by bad decisions, but this was different. This was someone deliberately creating a problem, then pretending it didn't exist. Karen wasn't mistaken. She wasn't confused. She was confident I wouldn't stop her. That confidence came from the same place I'd seen it come from countless times before, people assuming quiet meant weak. The event page stayed up overnight. By the next morning, more people had signed up. Comments filled with tent recommendations, questions about pets, excitement about escaping the city. Karen replied to nearly all of them. She assured people parking would be available. She told them security would be present. She promised a safe, guided experience. Every lie sat there in writing, time-stamped in public. I took screenshots of everything, saving copies to multiple drives, because I knew better than to rely on a single device. I didn't message Karen right away. There was no point. She'd already ignored cease and desist emails from my attorney regarding previous trespasses. I also knew confrontation would only encourage her to frame herself as the victim. Instead, I called the county assessor's office and confirmed, again, that no temporary use permits had been issued. Then I called zoning, then the sheriff's non-emergency line, explaining calmly that a large unauthorized commercial event was being advertised on private property without owner consent. They listened, they asked questions, they told me they'd look into it. That afternoon, Karen showed up at my fence with 2 men I didn't recognize. They wore matching polo shirts with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest. She spoke loudly, clearly performing for an audience she assumed mattered more than me. She said I was overreacting. She said things were already paid for. She said canceling would upset people. She said it would look bad for me if I kept pushing. I told her calmly that she was trespassing and that she was being recorded. Her smile tightened. She shifted strategies instantly, accusing me of being hostile and difficult. One of the men suggested compromise, saying maybe they could share the space. I pointed to the survey stakes, the posted signs, and the printed deed in my hand. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply repeated that they had no permission to be there. When they finally left, Karen glanced back once, her expression irritation wrapped in disbelief. Over the next week, preparations around the development increased. Trucks arrived with portable toilets. Catering vans came through. I watched people unload equipment near access roads that didn't belong to them. Every image went into a folder. Every interaction was logged. Karen didn't hide what she was doing. She believed legitimacy came from confidence rather than approval. That belief would matter later. The bees sensed the activity before anyone else did. Increased vibrations, more foot traffic, sound carrying farther than usual. Beekeeping teaches awareness. You learn how sensitive living systems respond to disturbance. I adjusted routine slightly, staying observant but doing nothing unusual. Everything on my end remained normal, legal, and documented. 2 days before the scheduled event, a friend from the department stopped by. He'd seen the event page circulating and wanted to check on me. We walked the fence line together. I showed him the evidence. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he nodded once and told me to keep doing exactly what I was doing. Calm, prepared, patient. People like that defeat themselves, he said. They just need time and witnesses. The night before the event, I hardly slept, not from fear, but from awareness. Experience teaches you when you're standing at the edge of something that can't be undone. I knew by morning there would be hundreds of strangers arriving, believing they had every right to be there. They would be confused, annoyed, and frustrated when confronted with reality. Karen would blame me. The situation would escalate whether anyone wanted it to or not. Just after sunrise, cars started lining the road. They came in waves, SUVs packed with gear, vans, compact cars overlow, dead with tents and coolers. People stepped out laughing, stretching, pointing toward my land like it belonged to them. Music played, doors slammed, engines idled. I stood near my barn, visible but not obstructive, recording from a legal distance. Karen arrived mid-morning, clipboard in hand, headset on, acting like a festival coordinator. When she saw me, she froze for half a second, then recovered, smiling brightly as if nothing were wrong. I walked forward calmly, stated once that this was private property and that permission had never been granted. She spoke over me, addressing the crowd instead, telling them everything was under control. That's when the first argument broke out. Someone demanded refunds. Someone else insisted Karen had promised guaranteed access. A few people noticed the signs posted everywhere. Confusion spread quickly because large groups amplify uncertainty. Karen pulled out her phone, calling someone, pacing, her voice rising as she realized authority wasn't backing her the way she expected. The bees reacted to the noise before anyone else did. Increased movement, disturbed air, unfamiliar activity near their environment. It wasn't aggression. It was instinctive response to disruption. I didn't touch the hives. I didn't alter anything. Nature responded on its own terms, the way it always does when provoked. Shouting turned to panic. People scattered. Karen dropped her clipboard. Emergency services arrived faster than I expected, responding to multiple calls at once. Deputies established control. Medical teams treated minor injuries. No one was seriously harmed, but the event was over before it ever really began. Officers interviewed witnesses. I handed over documentation calmly. Karen tried to speak, but the evidence spoke louder. Permits didn't exist. Permission was never given. Money had already changed hands. By the time the crowd leered and vehicles left, Karen stood staring at the empty field, her confidence finally gone. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks, knowing the truth had finally arrived on its own. The following week felt quieter on the surface, but underneath it carried the same tension you feel before a storm fully clears. Word had spread quickly around town about what happened. Some people exaggerated it. Others downplayed it, but everyone knew Karen's retreat hadn't gone the way she planned. I didn't celebrate. Experience taught me that real consequences take time, not cheering. What mattered now was staying steady while everything continued to unravel. Karen didn't contact me at all during the first few days. Online, the event page disappeared. Comments were deleted, refund requests started popping up in unrelated community groups. People were angry, confused, and asking questions Karen no longer answered. I saved what I could before it vanished entirely. Screenshots, cached pages, payment confirmations people posted publicly. Digital evidence is fragile if you don't assume it will be erased. 2 days later, an investigator from the county requested a formal statement. I invited him onto my porch, kept my tone neutral, and laid out the timeline exactly as documented. No editorializing, no emotion. Facts stacked neatly tend to speak for themselves. He thanked me for being organized, which told me everything I needed to know about how often he dealt with situations like this. Karen finally broke her silence that evening. She showed up again, this time alone, parking partly in my driveway as if proximity equaled authority. Her posture was different now, less confidence, more tension. She said she felt blindsided. She said no one told her the land was off limits. She said she thought there were shared access rights. Each sentence contradicted statements she'd made publicly. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, I informed her calmly that further contact should go through legal channels and that she was trespassing. She stared at me for a long moment, searching for something that wasn't there. Anger, fear, guilt. She found none of it, then she left. The HOA board didn't take much longer to react. Notices went out announcing an emergency meeting. Residents discussed miscommunication and unfortunate outcomes. Nobody said Karen's name directly at first, but everyone knew who the subject was. I watched from a distance, not interested in attending. Internal politics were never my concern. Responsibility was. Meanwhile, the county investigation expanded. Animal control verified my registrations. Zoning confirmed no permits had been issued. Payment processors flagged numerous complaints. One agency forwarded concerns to another. Each piece alone meant little. Together, they formed a pattern Karen could no longer ignore. A week later, I received a call asking if I would be willing to provide copies of my documentation to the district attorney's office for review. That was the moment I knew this had moved beyond neighborhood drama. Commercial fraud, misrepresentation, trespass. These weren't HOA issues anymore. These were legal ones. Karen tried a new narrative online shortly after. She framed herself as overwhelmed, claiming volunteers acted independently and that she was being unfairly targeted. Comments pushed back hard. People shared screenshots contradicting her statements. Former supporters distanced themselves. Digital footprints have a way of resurfacing when denial becomes loud enough. I continued my normal routine. Bees don't care about controversy. They need consistency. The quiet helped maintain perspective. When you spend years responding to crisis, you learn the importance of not letting chaos dictate your pace. Let systems work. Let facts surface. Let people show who they are when no one is rescuing them. One afternoon, a reporter called. A small local outlet, nothing sensational. He asked if I would comment. I declined politely but confirmed the basic facts. Private land, no permission, documented evidence. That evening, an article ran summarizing the incident without embellishment. It didn't paint heroes or villains. It simply stated what happened. That was more damaging to Karen's position than outrage ever could be. The HOA meeting became contentious. Residents demanded answers. Board members resigned. Karen's authority evaporated in real time. She attempted to speak but was interrupted repeatedly. People wanted refunds, explanations, accountability. She offered none that held up. Within days, she was removed as HOA president pending investigation. I didn't attend. I didn't gloat. I had no interest in watching someone else's downfall. The goal was peace, not spectacle. Then the civil notices arrived. Companies Karen had hired wanted payment. Participants filed small claims. Vendors disputed contracts. Each problem added pressure from a different angle. Accountability rarely arrives as a single blow. It comes as weight, applied steadily, until there's nowhere left to shift it. Late one evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I sat on the porch holding a mug of tea sweetened with honey from the last harvest. The land was quiet again. No strangers, no music, no entitlement pretending ownership. The tranquility felt earned rather than borrowed. That night, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. A voicemail followed. Karen's voice, unsteady. She asked if we could talk, person to person. She said lawyers were making things worse, that she wanted to resolve this privately. I didn't respond. Some conversations happened too late to matter. By the time the SECO ND week ended, the story no longer belonged to Karen. It had moved beyond personalities and into records, timelines, and consequences. That shift is always the point where denial collapses. People can argue opinions endlessly, but documentation has no interest in debate. It simply exists. The first official notice came from the county, stating that an unauthorized commercial event had been held on private property, resulting in violations tied to zoning, health, and safety. The letter was formal, restrained, and unmistakably serious. Karen was named directly this time. No hedging language, no ambiguity, just facts. Payment processors followed soon after. Attendees had filed chargebacks, citing misrepresentation. Funds were frozen pending review. Some people received partial refunds automatically, others didn't. Confusion turned into frustration, and frustration has a way of seeking answers loudly. Karen's inbox filled with demands she could no longer ignore or redirect. Her husband contacted me once briefly. He apologized without specifics, which told me plenty. He asked if there was any way I could make a statement. That might reduce the fallout. I told him truthfully that I'd already made my statement, and it consisted solely of facts. He thanked me quietly and ended the call. The HOA board fractured completely. 2 members resigned outright, another disavowed prior decisions publicly. Emergency elections were announced. The development that once spoke with Karen's voice now scrambled to distance itself from her actions. Public denial became survival strategy. Meanwhile, the legal process unfolded with unremarkable efficiency. Investigators requested timestamps. They compared Karen's public assurances to official records. They reviewed contracts with vendors who claimed faith in her authority. Every version of events led back to the same issue. She had assumed power she didn't have and sold it as permission. Weeks passed without direct interaction between us. I returned to my routines fully. The bees thrived as summer settled in. The land healed quickly, grass grows back, soil settles. People forget faster than they think, unless accountability forces memory to stay. Then a formal request arrived, asking if I would testify, should charges move forward. I agreed, not out of spite, but because responsibility requires participation. Refusing would have been easier emotionally, but easier isn't the same as right. I prepared as I always had. Notes ordered, timelines confirmed, calm maintained. Karen attempted another approach, this time through a mediator. The message suggested a quiet settlement, mutual statements, and an agreement to move forward peacefully. I declined again. Settlements acknowledge risk, not truth. I wasn't the one at risk. The court date was scheduled for the fall. In the meantime, civil claims continued stacking. Vendors sought compensation. Participants demanded restitution. Karen's carefully constructed image as organizer and leader dissolved into a series of conflicting stories she couldn't reconcile. The reporter returned once more, asking for comment on the upcoming proceedings. I gave a single sentence. This was never about conflict, it was about consent. The article printed it without embellishment. One afternoon, months after the event, Karen drove past the property without stopping. The SUV looked smaller somehow, less significant. She didn't look my way. I didn't wave. Some endings don't need ceremony. The bees prepared for winter as schedules shifted. Hives were reinforced, stores checked, everything done carefully, patiently. Nature responds best to consistency. So do systems. The legal resolution arrived quietly. Charges were filed related to misrepresentation and unauthorized commercial activity. Fines were issued. Restitution orders followed. Karen accepted a plea agreement that removed uncertainty but formalized consequence. She resigned from the HOA permanently as part of the resolution. When the news reached town, reactions were muted. No cheers, no outrage, just acknowledgement. People moved on. That too is a form of justice. Several weeks later, a handwritten note arrived in the mail. No return address. Inside, a brief message thanking me for showing restraint. No signature. I set it aside without response. Life returned to normal gradually. New HOA leadership introduced rules discouraging overreach. Boundaries were clarified. Access points were reinforced. My land remained mine officially and practically. Sometimes people asked if I felt vindicated. I told them no. Vindication implies desire for outcome. What I felt was resolution. There's a difference. One seeks triumph, the other accepts closure. The bees continued their work, unaware they'd played any role in human conflict. They were never tools. They were simply living beings responding to disruption, like everything else in the story. As autumn approached, I harvested a final batch of honey and shared jars with neighbors who had stood quietly but firmly in support. No speeches, no lessons, just gratitude exchanged without emphasis. Looking back, the situation could have ended much worse if handled differently. Anger would have escalated it. Silence would have enabled it. Documentation changed the trajectory. Calm allowed the truth to surface on its own terms. That's what people often misunderstand about confrontation. It isn't about force, it's about clarity. The moment you remove confusion, the outcome becomes inevitable. Now the land is quiet again. The fences stand, the signs remain. The bees hum steadily, indifferent to authority struggles, focused entirely on their purpose. And I walk the property each morning the same way I always have, knowing that boundaries only matter when someone is willing to enforce them without emotion. Time has a way of stripping drama out of events and leaving only their meaning behind. By the time winter settled in, what remained of the situation wasn't anger or triumph, but a clearer understanding of how easily people confuse authority with entitlement. The land never changed. Only the people around it did. Court proceedings moved slower than public reaction, but they were steady. I testified on a Thursday morning in a room that smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Karen sat at the defense table, posture rigid, expression carefully neutral. She didn't look my way. I didn't need her to. The judge listened patiently as timelines were presented, documents entered into record, statements cross-checked against public postings and payment logs. Nobody raised voices. Nobody needed to. The facts were complete. When my turn came, I answered each question clearly. I kept emotion out of it the same way I had for years in official reports. Ownership established. Permission denied. Evidence provided. Impact documented. The prosecutor asked if I had ever agreed to share the land. I said no. The defense asked if I had attempted to stop the event physically. I said no. Calm answers didn't give the room anything to argue with. Karen's statement came later. She spoke about intentions, misunderstandings, community spirit. The judge listened politely, then referred back to records that contradicted nearly every claim. Intent doesn't override consent. Enthusiasm doesn't replace ownership. The law is simple that way. The ruling formalized what everyone already understood: financial penalties, restitution, restrictions on future organizational roles. No dramatic sentencing, no spectacle, just accountability applied methodically. Karen nodded as it concluded, looking smaller than she ever had during those early confrontations. Outside the courthouse, the reporter waited again, notebook tucked under one arm. I declined comment this time. Some moments don't need summarizing. Truth had done its work. Spring returned slowly. The land softened under rain. Grass filled in where tents once pressed it flat. The bees emerged stronger than the previous year, their numbers healthy, their rhythms unchanged. Life continued without apology or commentary. The HOA elected new leadership. Notices went out clarifying property boundaries and private land restrictions. Language was careful. You could tell lawyers had been involved. Sometimes education only sticks after consequences make it necessary. People who attended the failed retreat stopped by occasionally, usually embarrassed, sometimes apologetic. They admitted they hadn't questioned the event page or checked details. It was easier to assume legitimacy than to verify it. I told them I understood. Most nodded, relieved that the situation hadn't ended worse. One woman returned later with her children standing by the fence line respectfully this time. She asked questions about bees, about pollination, about how long it took to learn. Her kids listened quietly, curiosity replacing entitlement. I answered what I could, careful to keep boundaries intact. Interest is welcome. Assumption isn't. Karen moved out of the development before summer. No announcement, no farewell post. A moving truck arrived early one morning and was gone by afternoon. People noticed but didn't discuss it much. The story had already reached its ending. Occasionally I thought about how differently things might have unfolded if I had reacted emotionally at the beginning. Yelling, threats, confrontation for confrontation's sake. Experience taught me that escalation invites chaos, and chaos favors no one who expects justice. Documentation became my quiet companion throughout the process. Friends teased me about keeping records even after resolution. Old habits don't disappear. Preparedness doesn't switch off. You hope you never need it again, but you keep it anyway. Late one afternoon, as sunlight stretched across the pasture, a neighbor stopped to chat. He thanked me for holding the line. I shrugged. Lines don't hold themselves. Someone has to respect them enough to stand still. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected. Boundaries aren't aggressive. They're descriptive. They tell people where responsibility begins and ends. Problems arise when someone decides those lines apply to everyone except themselves. The bees prepared for another season. Frames filled gradually. Queens laid steadily. Order restored itself without ceremony. Watching that process reminded me that balance isn't loud. It simply persists. As summer approached again, the town moved on. New controversies replaced old ones. Attention shifted. That's normal. Very few people live inside single stories for long. What matters is that lessons remain even when attention fades. I began giving honey to the local food pantry along with handwritten notes explaining its source. People appreciated the gesture. Some recognized the name, others didn't. Either way, the sweetness had nothing to prove. One evening, while cleaning the barn, I found an old photo of my grandfather standing in the same field decades earlier, hat pulled low, posture relaxed. He'd lived through his own share of disputes, losses, and struggles. He understood land differently than many do now. Ownership meant stewardship, not dominance. Standing there, I realized that what had happened wasn't unique. It was simply modern entitlement colliding with something older and quieter but far more durable. Paperwork and patience don't make headlines, but they shape outcomes just the same. I locked the barn and walked back toward the house as dusk settled in. The hum from the hives blended into the evening air, steady and unbothered. Everything was where it belonged. And for the first time since Karen arrived, that quiet felt permanent again. Resolution doesn't arrive with noise. It shows up quietly, often after Aten. Tone has moved elsewhere. That was the lesson that stayed with me most, as the final paperwork cleared and life settled into something predictable again. Justice isn't dramatic from the inside. It's procedural, it's patient, and it's far less satisfying to observers than chaos, which is probably why so many people confuse the two. Months passed without incident. The county closed its file once penalties were paid and compliance confirmed. Vendors received restitution through civil judgments. Refunds were processed where possible. The machines of accountability, slow as they can be, completed their work and shut themselves off again. That silence felt earned. I adjusted my routine slightly after everything was over. Not out of fear, but awareness. Experience teaches you how fragile peace can be when taken for granted. I reinforced fencing where foot traffic had worn it down. I replaced signs that had faded. Clear boundaries prevent confusion long before conflict has a chance to form. Occasionally someone new would stop at the fence line and ask if they could take photos of the bees. I appreciated that they asked. Permission isn't complicated, but it matters. Sometimes I said yes, sometimes I said no. Both answers were accepted without argument, which meant progress had occurred whether anyone recognized it or not. The new HOA leadership reached out once to introduce themselves. The tone was respectful. They clarified they had no questions, only an interest in maintaining good relations moving forward. We agreed on nothing more than mutual acknowledgement of boundaries. That was enough. Karen's name stopped appearing in conversations. At first, people brought her up cautiously, testing reactions. Eventually, they didn't bring her up at all. Time does that. It dulls edges, erases urgency, and leaves behind whatever lessons were strong enough to persist without reinfo. Every now and then, someone would ask me what the turning point was. They expected a moment of confrontation or clever maneuvering. I told them it wasn't a moment, it was a method. Calm response. Documentation. Letting institutions work. There's no shortcut for that, and no audience while it happens. The bees thrived that year. Pollination across nearby properties improved measurably. Garden yields increased. A neighbor joked that the healthiest thing to come out of the whole ordeal was local agriculture. Humor finds its way into almost anything once enough time passes. As autumn returned, I hosted a small gathering for the neighbors who had stood with me quietly throughout the situation. No speeches, no stories, just food, conversation, and gratitude. Community doesn't need grand gestures, it needs consistency. One of the children who had visited earlier returned with a school project about ecosystems. She included a photo of the hives taken from the fence line. Her teacher later sent a note thanking me for encouraging respectful curiosity. That mattered more than any headline ever could have. Sometimes, in the evenings, I thought about Sharon, about how she would have reacted to the commotion, probably rolling her eyes at the dramatics and reminding me to stay calm. She believed deeply in fairness but had no patience for theatrics. I like to think she would have approved of how things ended. I never released bees. I never needed to. That misunderstanding followed the story online, exaggerated into something theatrical and false. What actually happened was simpler and more instructive. When people disturb systems they don't understand, consequences arise naturally. The bees behaved exactly as biology dictates. No malice, no intent, just response. That detail mattered to me because narratives have power, and inaccurate ones distort accountability. His wasn't revenge. It was inevitability. Boundaries crossed, reactions followed, systems engaged, outcomes delivered. That sequence exists everywhere, whether people acknowledge it or not. Winter arrived gently. The hives insulated. Stores adequate. Losses minimal. Another season completed without incident. The land remained what it had always been, patient and unchanged by human drama. Late one night I found myself rereading some of the earlier documentation out of habit. Dates, messages, claims now resolved. I archived everything properly, labeling folders clearly, not because I expected trouble, but because closure deserves organization. Letting go doesn't require forgetting, it requires order. Living through that experience reinforced something I'd learned long before retirement. Authority that isn't earned eventually exposes itself. Power borrowed from confidence alone collapses when scrutiny arrives. Structures exist for a reason, even when people treat them like inconveniences. I still walk the land every morning. That ritual didn't change. The path along the fence, the pause near the hives, the glance toward the field where tents once stood. Memory doesn't vanish, but it loses its weight when justice has somewhere to land. There's a temptation to dramatize endings, to turn resolution into triumph. Real endings don't work that way. They taper off, they normalize, they let life resume without reference to conflict. If there's a lesson worth carrying forward, it's this. You don't need to be loud to be firm. You don't need to be aggressive to be effective. You don't need enemies to protect what's yours. You need clarity, patience, and the willingness to stand quietly while systems catch up to truth. That approach won't satisfy everyone. It won't trend. It won't generate applause. But it works. Now when the evening settles and the light softens across the pasture, the only sound is that familiar hum, steady and indifferent to the passing stories of people. The bees do their work. The land holds its ground. And I consider that outcome enough.